Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reconciliation One-on-One, Conducting Research with Indigenous Peoples session. My name is Melina Damian, and I am Ontario Nature's Communications Coordinator. I will start with a few housekeeping items. So first, we will be recording this session, and to avoid any technical difficulties, please, we ask you to turn off your camera during the presentation. But if you're comfortable, you're welcome to turn it on during the discussion portion. This is a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, so please mute yourselves during the presentation and be conscious of background noise if you're unmuted. The features are visible if you scroll down towards the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat function for questions, including any technical issues. If there's something urgent, you're welcome to ask live. If you would like to change your name, you can click on the three dots on the top right of your image and select rename. And I will now pass it off to Dr. Julie Bowen, Ontario Nature's Boreal Program Manager out of our Thunder Bay office.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm having some internet difficulties tonight. I know Dr. Ray is as well. We live in the same neck of the woods, so I'm going to have my video off until we have our discussion session. I just want to welcome everyone to our second Indigenous Engagement Training webinar for Atlas 3. As we are not able to gather in person today, I will provide a land acknowledgement from where I reside. I'm calling in from Thunder Bay, which was built on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. Here we are all treaty people, and for those of us who live on the shoreline of the Gitchigami, also known as Lake Superior, we are signatories to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. I also acknowledge that the treaty was not negotiated in good faith, and promises within this treaty have been broken, and that the settler people on these lands have a responsibility to remedy that. These are the homelands of the Anishinaabeg people, and I also acknowledge the Métis people who have made their homes on these lands. Through my territorial land acknowledgement, I am reconfirming Atlas 3's commitment to conducting ourselves in the spirit and intent of reconciliation. In practice, this means making space for Indigenous leadership and knowledge systems in the work we are doing. It means respecting Indigenous protocols, Indigenous jurisdiction, and laws when conducting our surveys, and strengthening dialogue with Indigenous communities when invited to do so, and to explore to the fullest extent the way Atlas 3 can support their interests, rights, and unique relationships, roles, and responsibilities to this land. An important part of living this land acknowledgement is to both learn new ways of thinking and acting, and to unlearn any inherent biases, including entrenched thinking that can lead us to prioritize European or Western ways of knowing. Tonight's workshop is designed to help the staff and volunteers working on Atlas 3 to understand key considerations for working with Indigenous peoples in research settings, such as wildlife surveys, communications, and recognition. And we'll be learning about some of the issues with historical approaches to engaging Indigenous peoples in research, introduce Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and discuss practices for engaging in research respectfully with Indigenous peoples. And it is my great pleasure to again introduce Dr. Lana Ray, who will be leading our webinar today. Dr. Ray is an Anishinaabe scholar and from Upwagannissanen, also known as the Red Rock Indian Band, located in Northwestern Ontario. Dr. Ray is an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Learning at Lakehead University. She has previously worked in the public and not-for-profit sectors, including as a director of policy and research at a provincial Indigenous organization. And her work seeks to advance Indigenous social, cultural, and political realities through resurgent decolonial praxis. Dr. Ray is currently the principal investigator and co-principal investigator on several CIHR and SSHRC-funded research projects. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray back to our webinar series.
Miigwech Julie, so bonjour, Weskane Gijagok Nadishnakar, Zajal Kanoje, Nadodam, Apwaganissanen, Nadunjabad, Kamanistakwa, Nindao, Miigwech, Namama, Aki, Miigwech, Gitchigami, Miigwech, Anemki, Waju, Miigwech, Anemki Beneshi, Miigwech, Beneshi, Miigwech. So I won't go into too much detail about what I said there. And I'm working from the assumption that many of the people who attended the first session are here today. So if not, that's okay. There'll still be a lot of opportunities for learning and for discussion. But at the same time, I also wanted to build off of what we discussed last week as well. So I just began to, I think, complement the territorial land acknowledgement to give my own acknowledgement of who I am, where I'm situated, as well as to acknowledge different aspects of the land and different spirits and different nations. So today we're talking about Indigenous research. And so Indigenous research and reconciliation definitely are not mutually exclusive. And while there's limited, actually within the 94 calls to action, research is also discussed. So what this session is really going to be about, we're going to talk about Indigenous research, but talk about that in the context of reconciliation. So how can research with Indigenous peoples be part of the reconciliation process? So our objectives today, I'm working from the assumption that there may be people who this might be your first time engaged in research. So we're going to just spend a short amount of time just reviewing the overall research process. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the history of Indigenous research or research with Indigenous peoples. And perhaps just kind of a clarifying point. For space, I use the term Indigenous research, but I think that's something that we could even interrogate more. What is actually considered Indigenous research versus what is actually research that may be conducted in some regard with Indigenous peoples? So does having Indigenous involvement always necessarily make it Indigenous research? To describe and discuss the relationship between reconciliation and research, which I had already talked about, and then to also understand why Indigenous research is needed, and to explore really what are some wise practices around Indigenous research and how we could actually apply those today. And so I use the term wise practices. People may be more familiar with perhaps best practices or with promising practices, but it's just a different term, and it really is talking about having approaches that work within your localized context. So I think it's important to make that differentiation, especially in our conversations that we had last week when we were looking at the reconciliation process, its rollout, and we're discussing some of the critiques of reconciliation. And so one of those critiques was that the 94 calls to action were often used and implemented in a kind of a check the box or checklist approach. And so they weren't necessarily understood or discussed within localized context to see what would make sense within that context. So I just wanted to start here. I think particularly in the session that we had this time last week, when we worked on our birding scenario, one of the things that came out was, I think, this idea of the innocence of birding. So we're bird watching. So, you know, it's not like we're conducting different activities or things like that. So what possibly could be a problem with bird watching? So I just wanted to pose this question to people. So I put kind of the trees in the background here to denote here's people bird watching. And so now within the context of the atlas, people are still bird watching, but there's a different context here. So it's bird watching in the context of research. So does that change things? Is there a difference there? So maybe take a minute, just like last week when we kind of pondered around what is reconciliation. take a minute to think about that. And if you're comfortable with it, then you could also put your insights down within the chat box and I'll review them. So is there a difference between bird watching and bird watching as a method of research? So I'll give just a few more seconds for people to gather their thoughts. And I see we're starting to get some things come in the chat box. So it says required protocol and location versus optional. So I think what Lynn is getting at here is that by saying that there may be some differences in how you have to conduct yourself, then that means that there would actually be a difference of birding within this context. Philip says, guess my feeling is that intent is as important as action, so yes. Okay. And Julie says, bird watching of research will also involve communicating what we have discovered to others through our own lens and ways of knowing. So I guess similar to what Lynn is saying, there is a difference, and because of that difference, then it also requires us to perhaps act a little bit differently. So Lynn is mentioning that in terms of following protocols, and Julie's saying that also means that we have a responsibility to report back. And Jeff is saying, although both are focused on bird ID citizen science, maybe a different, more intrusive as we search habitats for evidence of breeding rather than just seeing birds. We urge to get to close, may have negative implications. Yeah, so there's always, when we look at the second one of bird watching within the context of research, where research is really about creating a story or a narrative or generating knowledge. And so whenever we do that, there's a relationship between right knowledge as well as with power. So how actually constructing that narrative has implications. So it could have social implications, could have political implications, could have economic implications. So it's really important that we, I think, move past this idea, or perhaps appreciate that birding within the context of the Atlas is definitely a bit of a different experience, as some people have really greatly indicated here. So yes, long story short, there is a difference, and we're going to talk about that. So here's maybe your first indication of how it's quite different. And so what is Indigenous research? So this is from Christine Neglia. So she's the manager of OCAP, which is something that we'll talk about a bit later, at the First Nations Information Governance. And the First Nations Information Governance Center is a center that is created and is driven by First Nation communities in Canada. And its purpose is to support self-determination in Indigenous research as well as in data governance. And so when we're thinking about Indigenous research, this idea expands beyond what perhaps maybe the typical academic or scholar may actually consider to be within the purview. So it includes kind of maybe the quote unquote traditional information you would see gathered about Indigenous people. So the kind of that demographic information. So those are things like when we had the Aboriginal People Survey, or what Stats Can is conducting, or similar work like that. So all of that kind of demographic information that talks about maybe our health outcomes and that sort of thing. And so I think that's probably historically anyways, where Indigenous research has lied, at least from an outsider perspective. And then Indigenous research is also what Christine says, really anything about us. And so that goes back to that idea that we had last week, where that concept of really nothing about us without us. So we see that same notion within reconciliation also apply within the context of research. So this could be really anything about our experience as Anishinaabe people, as Indigenous people. And so I think if we kind of look at where universities are at, I'd say they've probably come along and they're at this point. So they would accept the demographic piece, they would accept the about us piece, and there's different protocols and practices to ensure that that's done ethically, at least from a Western perspective. So that is still highly debatable. And then we see this third pillar when we're thinking about Indigenous research from Indigenous perspectives. And so the land. And this goes back to the conversations that we had last week, where I really introduced and I talked about the importance of the protocol, and I talked about treaty relationships that exist with other nations that are non-human nations. And so this idea that the land, the animals, the plants, etc., we also have a kingship relationship. So we have a close familial tie. And so that's why the land also needs to be included within Indigenous research. So what this means then, and implications for the Bird Atlas project, if we are to adhere to the First Nation Information Governance Center's understanding of research, or perhaps a better way to say it is assertion of self-determination in how they define research, then any activity that is occurring on traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people, of Indigenous peoples, also falls within the purview of Indigenous research. And so there's a few places, such as I believe within Northwest Territories, where these discussions are happening, and there are some mechanisms to account for this. But largely within Canada and certainly within Ontario, there's limited infrastructure right now to within mainstream institutions to account for this, and to ensure that researchers are conducting themselves in an ethical way, at least by Western standards. So now that we've had a chance to kind of define the parameters of Indigenous research, I just wanted to take a step back and to go over what the main steps are within a research process. And I guess one thing that's important to note here as well is that these show kind of the steps within, but all of this will still occur within the context of planning, as well as within the context of governance. So those are still kind of important key steps within research that kind of govern these different steps. But in terms of kind of the on the ground steps of technical steps of conducting research, here's what's basically the common main steps. So the first one is to define the problem or the issue. And so if you think about that within the context of your project, I assume it's probably something related to the need for conservation. So whether that looks at particularly deforestation, environmental degradation, but something along those lines. And so when you have a problem, then you need to think about a way that you could actually understand the problem or address it. And so depending on to your own paradigm or your own worldview of how you see the world, this will have a huge impact on how you decide to design the research project. And I should have put it up here, but I didn't. But there's a cartoon that I usually use when I talk about this. And it wanted to show the impacts of climate change. And in this cartoon, it has one person who's doing different measurements, and they're a scientist. And then there's a politician who's doing surveys with constituents to ask them about climate change. And so if you look at that example, you see there's different ways of understanding, or people are coming from different perspectives. So when we think of knowledge, one way we could think of knowledge is being socially constructed. So we as humans, we interact together, and that's how knowledge becomes produced. So asking humans about their views and what they think about climate change, that would fall within that social construction of knowledge. And so a lot of qualitative research, so research such as doing interviews or things like that, would fall within there. And then we also have this idea of empirical knowledge, which is where we see kind of that basic scientific method, right? Of maybe you have a theory and you test it. And also this is where a lot of quantitative information comes into play. And so for your project, you may have a little bit of both. So I understand it would be quantitative because you're doing counts. So you're using numbers to tell a story. But I'm not sure, maybe if perhaps there's a more descriptive component to that as well. So it's important to be aware of where you're coming from, and to understand that when you're designing a research project, that you're making decisions which usually privilege your own worldview or understanding when you're designing the project. And so from an Indigenous perspective too, I think this is where a major difference lies in terms of how perhaps we could come to know. So within Indigenous knowledge systems, we include empirical knowledge. And we see that, right? We've had, although our relationships with the animal nation expands beyond empirical relationships, but we very much have learned in many ways from observing the animal nation as well. And then we've also learned through our own perhaps interactions with each other and within the natural world that also inform our understandings. So we're seeing that social aspect too. But in addition to that empirical piece, as well as to the idea that knowledge can be socially constructed, and maybe that's perhaps best demonstrated through our processes of intergenerational knowledge transfer, where especially prior to colonization, those were intact and very purposeful in terms of how we translated information down from generations. Circles of where our elders could tell us stories and things like that. But we also have this other pillar or understanding of how knowledge is constructed. And so that's the spiritual construction of knowledge. And I've heard many elders talk about this, of how through our ceremonial processes, we could actually come to the same conclusions or our own conclusions that can be very detailed. So things as detailed as what kind of medicines do we have to take during COVID-19? And so that's a very different process than that basic science, standard scientific process that we see occurring, right? Where we see clinical trials, We see different vaccines being tested, and that's how that effectiveness is determined. So that looks really, really different than having our elders go into ceremony and accessing spiritual knowledge, which tells us the same sort of information. So it's really important, again, to always understand what paradigm am I working from? And are there then opportunities to expand this work that I'm doing? And understanding that what paradigm you're working from may in some ways limit the type of information that you could glean, as well as could limit what the possibilities could be that come out of your research. So the next step is data collection. So how are you going to collect the data? And I've talked about that to some degree. So data collection, right? It could look like a survey. It could look like a bird count, or it could look like going into ceremony. So those are all valid ways of collecting data. And the next step is the interpretation. So who's interpreting the data? And again, what paradigms are being used to interpret the data? So perhaps going back to that idea about having treaties and kingship relationships with non-human beings. So whether you believe that or not, how if you believe that versus if you don't believe that impacts how you are to interpret the data. And then the last piece is the dissemination. So how is that information then being rolled out? Who is it being shared with? How is it being shared? And what formats are it being shared with? Or what formats are being shared? And I laid this out in a really linear way, but we know that especially understanding all of this occurs within the context of planning and governance, that it may not be linear. So your dissemination process perhaps may be more of an iterative one, where it doesn't just happen at the very end, for example. So that's just a brief overview of the steps of research. And now I want to talk a little bit about the history of research with Indigenous peoples. And I say with, but over time, this relationship has really changed. So predominantly what this timeline is showing is that research hasn't been conducted with Indigenous peoples. Research has largely been conducted on Indigenous peoples. And so that's been done from Western paradigms, Western worldviews. And it's been done in a way that sees Indigenous peoples as objects of research versus being actively involved within the research process. And so I think we've now moved to a place, I say this generally because I unfortunately still hear and witness examples of irresponsible research with Indigenous peoples or about Indigenous peoples to this day. But so that idea of with is, I think perhaps maybe where the bird atlas is. So trying to include Indigenous peoples in the research project. And then kind of the last main characterization that we're moving towards to is research for Indigenous peoples. So what does that mean if we actually design and implement research projects in a way that addresses the needs of Indigenous communities as articulated by those Indigenous communities in ways that make sense to them. So those are kind of the three, I guess, simplest categories to think about. So research on Indigenous peoples, research with Indigenous peoples, and then research for Indigenous peoples. And so Indigenous research, I'll just call it that for simplicity. And I'm borrowing this. This is from a Cree scholar, Sean Wilson. And his book is called Research is Ceremony. So it's a short read if anyone's interested in learning more about Indigenous research. But he talks about really since that time of first contact, there was this idea of terra nullius. And that form of research was really European observations about the land. And we talked about this last week too, when we looked at kind of that historical context of conservation and environmentalism, and what are some key understandings that are important to be attuned to and be sensitive to, because they still have ongoing implications. And so one of them was this idea of terra nullius and observations of land. And so if you recall, this was really about empirical observations, which said the land wasn't being occupied because it wasn't being occupied in a way that made sense to the Europeans. And so this actually, in many ways, set the stage for the massive land thefts that we see in Canada as well as in other places, other settler colonial nations such as Australia. So this has kind of been the first wave of research. And so we see Indigenous peoples weren't included in any ways, any way, shape, or form. And we see that Indigenous paradigms were completely ignored. And then the second phase of research is called traditionalizing. And this was really about a colonial discourse to put forth this idea of dehumanization. So you're probably seeing a pattern here. Historically, research, Indigenous research, has been about working to affirm settler government's legitimacy to occupy land and to control land. And so within this traditionalizing phase, we saw a lot of fetishizing Indigenous peoples. This has happened elsewhere in terms of racialized people as well. You see this history of eugenics research. So all this kind of research that is trying to demonstrate that, you know, we don't have the same level of intelligence, looking at different measures, brain sizes, and things like that. And so very much kind of concerned in many ways with the physiology of Indigenous peoples to demonstrate that it's not that there was social differences between us, but that there was innate differences, and those differences cast us as Indigenous peoples as inferior. And so then the repercussion of that, if these people are inferior, if these people, you know, are barely human or aren't human from our perspective, from our criteria, then that allows us to justify the occupation of this land. That allows us to justify having control over this land. That allows us to justify the violence that we inflict on Indigenous peoples. And so we still see that today in terms of racism and discrimination. And there's multiple cases, right? We see that in terms of, there's been a lot of cases in the news recently. One example I think of the Indigenous woman Joyce Echewan in the healthcare system. And she was dehumanized, and then it allowed them to not provide her with care, the care that she needed. We've seen that a lot through the Black Lives and Indigenous Lives Matter movement. And so again, that dehumanization becomes a justification to assert police and state violence against Indigenous peoples. And we see this today even in terms of the land. So that idea of if we function from a place where we don't see the land as our kingship, as nations who have their own agency and their own rights and responsibilities to carry out, then it's also okay to assert violence against the land. And we see that in many cases with large resource development projects, which largely are in place to fulfill our wants, not necessarily our needs. And so the next phase then is this idea of assimilationist. And kind of within some of this too, there's been a transition where you have to understand the thought was we don't have to include Indigenous peoples because to a lot of what we're researching about Indigenous peoples is to have that just as a frame of reference because, right, we're in a process of eliminating them. So they won't exist moving forward. So if you don't think someone is going to exist if they're being erased, then there's no real frame of reference for accountability. They won't see the results or what we're saying about them in 50 years from now because they won't be around. And so there was a large period of Indigenous research which really worked from that place. It was more so about let's keep a catalog of the Indigenous peoples who were once here. And I had mentioned previously that, you know, some of this ideas or ideologies still exist. So actually just about a week and a half ago, I was at an Indigenous storytelling, and as a researcher who got a lot of money working out of the United States, had a whole research lab on this to talk about Indigenous stories. And they were an evolutionary anthropologist. And what they were looking at is they were looking in the public record at stories collected by anthropologists around 100 years ago. And they were trying to glean from the stories, you know, was there actually true or useful information within the stories? And so I think they thought what they were doing was actually good intentioned and good work to show, right, there was some intelligence here amongst Indigenous peoples at the time. But they didn't work with Indigenous peoples at all. And that resulted in a lot of misrepresentations and really harmful conclusions about Indigenous peoples. And so one of them was that many components of our stories weren't true. And another one, if we think back to those different steps of research, when the analysis was done, everything in the analysis was understood within the context of culture. So even though what she was talking about, I could see clearly demonstrated governance principles, it was still thought about under the umbrella of culture. And so that is an example of still some of that traditionalizing era of research where we know, right, only more sophisticated beings have governance structures. So this couldn't have been a governance structure among Indigenous peoples. And that idea of disappearance was also present. So when I had asked about, you know, why didn't she include Indigenous peoples, her response is that those people don't exist anymore, which was very far from the truth, right? It was inaccurate characterization. But by doing that, then she was able to evade accountability and able to evade and recognize the title holders of those stories within Indigenous nations. And so the assimilationist era, that was really about researching the Indian problem. So we've gotten to a place, full elimination didn't work in a physical sense. And so how are we going to deal with this quote unquote Indian problem, which continues to unsettle our legitimacy as a state here on these lands in what's now known as Canada. So this was about trying to maybe solve things like high rates of alcoholism within Indigenous communities. And so we know now, largely because of research conducted by Indigenous peoples within appropriate and relevant frameworks, is that mental health and addictions is largely related to colonial trauma. And it's not something that was perhaps innate to Indigenous peoples or something innate within our physiology or our mental state, which made us more susceptible to addictions. And so from 1990, that's the stage of early Aboriginal research. And so that in some ways still continues to kind of carry on those traditions from the past, but it's just in a formal way within the university structure. And so even in Indian residential schools, right? So there's a lot of forms of research too that aren't necessarily characterized as research because they aren't occurring in a university, but they are still very much research and so should adhere to wise practice standards. So in Indian residential schools, there was experiments on children in terms of ear experiments, as well as nutritional experiments too, where Indigenous children were starved. So overall, there's kind of been a history where Indigenous research hasn't in any way worked to, not only has it worked to legitimize the state, so in that respect, it definitely has not worked at all to kind of unsettle some of these power relationships that exist between Indigenous peoples and settler nations. And much of the research has really been about this idea of parachute research. So you kind of jump into communities or territories, get what you need, and jump out. So there's different names for that. Extractionist research is another one. Probably the term that I think gives the best idea for me, I heard this term come out of Curve Lake, referring to researchers as zigame, which means mosquitoes. So that idea of, sometimes you don't even know they're there, they're in, they're extracting what they need, and then they're out. So that unfortunately has been the history of research. And so many people still carry those memories. And on the flip side, in many ways, this type of research has also been normalized. So just because you're coming into a community and what you present, they may say they're okay with it. I wouldn't assume that it's because they are 100% okay with it. It's important to understand that even research done today, there's still a lot of instances where it's still focused on the researcher need. And so those are behaviors that unfortunately have been normalized in terms of research. And so I've worked with different groups, Indigenous groups, and I've gotten comments before like, well, are you sure this is research? Because it was done in a different way. It was done in a way where there was actually, practical outcomes for Indigenous peoples. They were involved in the process. So that didn't even register as research because it held a certain connotation. So that would be for conducting research with Indigenous peoples too. I wouldn't make assumptions. And I think that could be part of the reconciliation process of understanding, because there's been a lot of Indigenous scholars who have written about this, who have articulated these practices, Indigenous community members too, and to actually take those forward and make a commitment to implement them. And if the partners you're working with aren't aware, to also share this information with them and have a discussion with them. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about or making that connection between research and reconciliation. And so this is a recap from our last session. So I've just picked one example of how reconciliation could be articulated, which you see here. So this articulation speaks to harmony, speaks to conversation, closing the gap, and restoration. So take some time, read through these, and then reflect on them. So the way that reconciliation is articulated here, does this reflect our reconciliation conversation last week? So is this the same understanding you hold from last week? Or do you see areas that require perhaps some changes or improvements? I'll give you a minute or two to read this over and do some reflecting. So what does everyone think? Do you think this kind of covers it all, or are there some key pieces that may be missing here? Oh, so I see a conversation or a question here about how do people who have minimal linkage to Indigenous heritage fit into the conversation? So I think maybe something that's important to understand in terms of Indigenous identity, that it's been something that has been, or at least attempts have been made by the federal government to control who is Indigenous, right? Or perhaps who is, in this case, First Nation or Métis in particular. And so this is really because there's implications, again, going back to that idea of legitimacy, the settler state's legitimacy or claim to this land or this territory. So again, as long as we exist as Indigenous peoples, there's always going to be a threat there. So one tactic has been for the federal government to try to define and restrict our identity. And so in fact, Mi'kmaq scholar and lawyer Pam Pominer, she has a book on this. I think it's called Rethinking Identity. I'm not quite sure. But she does calculations and says, you know, not in the too distant future, we may not actually have status First Nations anymore, which are those who are recognized by the federal government having particular Aboriginal rights. So in terms of identity, I think there's a couple of different components there. So one is a process of self-identification. And I say self-identification, but also a process of actualizing that. So what are your relationships to territory? What are your relationships to community? There's also a component of community recognition. So are you claimed by a community? At the same time, understanding that, you know, that is also a bit problematic because efforts were also made by the state to remove people from their communities. So in addition to Indian residential schools, there was also the 60s scoop, where children were scooped from their families and sent to, in some cases sold, to non-Indigenous families. And a lot of those records were destroyed. So it's hard for some people to regain that connection. So I don't think there's one clear answer as to what that looks like. but I think maybe perhaps that intention piece is really important too. And so that's kind of what we've seen in the news a lot in terms of people perhaps using, whether they have any Indigenous blood in them or not, but using that to their own benefit for their own gain. So I think that that relationship piece is really important, and an understanding of, you know, if you are going to assert an Indigenous identity, where is that coming from? So I'm just looking, there's any more comments here. What may be missing? Where does two-way learning teaching fall into this chart? We are all looking at birds. How do we look? How do we see and how do we describe? How does our intruding in a critical period of birds' lives fits within Indigenous treaties? Yeah, so I may just hold off on that point because I'm going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But that's a great point to make. Okay, so just to recap, when we look at reconciliation, I would say this has definitely been part of the conversation that we've had, but I think it's weak in a number of areas. So one, I think that last comment was a perfect segue into talking about this. This understanding of reconciliation doesn't really emphasize in many ways the importance of Indigenous paradigms or Indigenous worldviews. So that piece is kind of absent here, as well as Indigenous self-determination and that restitution or action piece are also quite weak to non-existent here. So there's a lot of focus on this definition on, I'd say, maybe very passive forms of action. So have a critical conversation. So we know a conversation is great, but if the conversation stops there, then it's not really going to do much in terms of impacting reconciliation. So I just bring this up because as you're in different spaces too, you may get confronted with different notions of reconciliation. So being able to kind of apply those principles that we talked about and those understandings to actually assess if it's an actual form of reconciliation or what's often been called inclusive reconciliation. Or last week we used the term, I think we used the term moves to innocence. So does it give the perception of change being made, but at the crux of it, is it actually doing anything to disrupt those power relationships, to disrupt privilege, to disrupt kind of those concepts of whiteness that we talked about, of what's kind of seen as normalized within our society. So this is basically what we talked about last week, but just worded a little bit different. So this is by Indigenous scholar Robina Thomas, and she says then, by definition, reconciliation is the action of making one's view or belief compatible with another. What views or beliefs are we trying to reconcile? Who needs to reconcile with whom? I don't think we're even close to beginning to do that. I get concerned that by focusing on reconciliation, we turn away from the crimes of the past and ignore their connections to the present. So we talked about all of this last week in terms of going back to that definition of reconciliation. There's really been an emphasis on that piece about mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, but often a lack of acknowledgement that that definition really talks about a precursor to that, needing to be both an acknowledgement and awareness, as well as restitution for the harm that's been caused, to be able to be at that place. So obviously mutually respectful relationships moving forward are great and need to happen. But if that's all that happens, it still does not complete a process of reconciliation. And so why I like this quote too by Robina Thomas is I think there's some key points here that make direct connections back to the research process. So in here, I think she's talking about really what we do and how do we do them. So going back to when we talked about when we're developing our question and we're developing our research design. So really thinking about critically about what do we do and how are we doing that? So again, bring back that idea of whiteness as a social norm that we talked about last week. So what idea of conservation maybe is privileged within deciding what the problem is? So what do we do and how do we do it? Maybe then thinking about what ways of understanding the world are being privileged, in particular when we're thinking about how do we do that? So how do we create our research design? Are we working within that place of empirical knowledge? Are we working within that place of understanding knowledge being socially constructed? Or is there also space for thinking about knowledge being spiritually constructed too? And also then if we aren't doing some of those things, then how are we at least acknowledging maybe where our limitations are in terms of what might be possible in terms of the work you're doing, as well as how may that impact different pathways moving forward? Would certain pathways then be eliminated if we're working within a construct of whiteness in terms of conservation research? So I'm just looking at the time. What I'm thinking is maybe we could take just a short break here. And then I want to talk about some wise practices in Indigenous research and give people some more time to actually explore and engage within our closing activity that we'll do. So if people want to just take, I would say we're at 11, my clock says 11:02. So is 5 minutes okay for everyone? And then I can come back, I'll present this piece and then have a chance for us to do more engagement. Okay, so I'm getting a thumbs up from John. So I have 11:02 now, so if we could all come back at 11:07. So in terms of wise practices, I want to touch on two in particular. And this first one, I guess, is more so about governance. And the next one I'm going to talk about is kind of more so a broad set of principles. So this first wise practice is called the OCAP Principles. And so the OCAP Principles are, as you could see here by the symbol, are actually a registered trademark of the First Nations Information Governance Center. And so I had spoken about them prior. So a lot of this really came out of the First Nations Information Governance Center, and the OCAP Principles came about because of the era of research of trying to, that era of trying to address the quote unquote Indian problem. And so a lot of research was being done on Indigenous peoples, which really just talked about the gap that existed. And it still exists, but we know there's particular reasons for that. So the gaps in terms of health outcomes, gaps in terms of education outcomes, etc. And so there very much was this deficit approach being taken to Indigenous research. And still at this point too, we were very much only seen as objects of research. And so we weren't seen as being able to create relevant solutions to problems that we were experiencing. So all this did was it just kind of furthered the stereotypes that existed about Indigenous peoples, and then furthered, right, a lot of the discrimination and really hatred that Indigenous peoples experience on a day-to-day basis, living within their own traditional territories. So the First Nations Information Governance Center said we're going to take, or I should say First Nations said we're going to take control over our own research. We're going to be self-determining. And so they still do put out their own regional health surveys, which were crafted with Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples, and for Indigenous peoples, and include measures that are relevant. And then also when the information is disseminated, they're able to choose what is disseminated to the broader public, what isn't, and how are we going to contextualize this information as well. So the way that it's governed by these principles. And so the acronym OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And maybe a note too, so why it is actually registered now is because just like the idea of reconciliation, it very much was becoming appropriated. So it became this buzzword then if, just like if we're going to put forth a proposal, we need to mention reconciliation and talk about how our project is a form of reconciliation. This was similar. Okay, if we're applying for research funding, we need to put in place that we're following the OCAP principles. But what was happening, and still does happen, unfortunately, and I've witnessed that, is that, again, these principles have been appropriated and then they aren't fulfilled to their full capacity. So it's usually a much watered down version, if the principles are even fulfilled at all. And so there's a number of reasons why, there's barriers to actualizing these principles. And one case, for example, could be infrastructure as well. And so I'll talk about that kind of throughout these principles. So the first principle is ownership. And so this refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. So within this principle, it states that a community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns their personal information. So what this ownership piece means is that if something comes out of the research process and you're working with an Indigenous community and they say, we're not publishing on this, it means we're not publishing on this. So they have a right to make decisions about their data because they own it. And so if we think about this in the broader context of research, which includes demographic, which includes about us, the experience piece, and includes land, if the OCAP principles are followed, there's huge implications there. And you'll notice a distinction here too is in terms of the idea of having collective ownership versus individual. So right now, it kind of works in a way where individuals are considered the owners of their data. However, if you participate in a research project, then when you sign the consent form, usually you're kind of relinquishing that control or that ownership in some way. And so then it's the researcher who could then write a report, write an article, have their name on it. And they're in many ways considered to be the owners of that information. So we have a system right now which very much privileges individuality and very much privileges the individual ownership of the researcher. And so I'll give you an example of this too. So this was a case a number of years ago, and I think it's finally getting worked out now. But in the East Coast, there was a community and they were trying to engage in language revitalization. And so there was interviews of oral histories that took place with their traditional knowledge holders or elders. And so because of the way Canadian law worked, the person who did the transcription, which again, we're also seeing a form of epistemological racism, right? So certain ways of knowing are seen as important and valid over other ways. In this case, we're seeing in that example, the written language being more important or valued or valid than the oral history. But the individual who did the transcriptions, they then had ownership, individual ownership over that information. And there was many other problems here, but basically was not letting the community publish resources, and he was paid for his time to transcribe too, but wasn't letting the community actually create language resources without giving him a royalty, which they refused to do because it was their own community knowledge. So OCAP ownership is really important, but then there's also challenges to being able to achieve that. And so the second principle is control. And so that's really part of that assertion of ownership. So if I own something, I should be able to control it, right? So just like if I own a house versus renting a house, if I own the house, I don't have to ask the homeowners association, right? If I want to paint my house or make changes or anything like that, I own it, so I have control over it. So that same idea here. So control affirms that First Nations, their communities, and representative bodies are within their rights in seeking control over all aspects of the research and information management processes that impact them. So this principle extends to the control of resources and review processes, planning, management, and so on. So both that context piece of planning and governance, as well as when we looked at the research steps. So control doesn't mean going to a community after the project is already developed and asking them to participate. So that is not consistent with the OCAP principles. Or control, again, doesn't mean we'll include them in the process, but then if there's something that we don't like, or then we will just ignore them at that point where it's no longer convenient for us. And that may seem like who would do that? But again, that also happens. I remember this was maybe about 10 years ago now, but I was involved in a research project that had the OCAP principles in place. And I was a representative for the community organization. So we were the collective that was being represented or supposed to be being protected within the OCAP principles. And so we had a very different stance on or interpretation of the results that were coming out. And we had problems because the other people involved, the academics involved, were largely non-Indigenous peoples working from Toronto, which we felt had a very difficult time understanding the experiences of Indigenous peoples within Northwestern Ontario. And so when we came to assert this principle of ownership through control and saying, you know, the way that this is presented here is not appropriate and it will not be published, that was ignored. And the only thing the researcher was willing to do was to actually have a statement that said that the organization I worked with did not agree with the results. So that is the other piece of ensuring the the enforcement of OCAP as well. So oftentimes there's a lot of work done up front, but also thinking about making sure there's processes and mechanisms in place to follow through then as well. And so then access is the other piece. So right, if I own something, I should be able to access it and access it freely and decide who else I want to access it as well. So that's really what that principle is referring to. So that First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it's held. And so what this speaks to too is that not every community maybe has the infrastructure to be able to house records. And so there may be a case where there's another organization acts as stewards of that information on their behalf. But even if that's the case, they should be able to access it and also access it in a really timely manner. And we still see this too in terms of the government, and I'm thinking in the context of health, where information is collected about us and is even shared sometimes with corporations, and we ourselves as First Nations don't have access to that same information. And again, going back to that earlier conversation we had about knowledge being power. So there's a particular reason why that occurs. So then in terms of access, this also applies kind of even throughout the process as well. And then the last one is possession. So while ownership identifies a relationship between a people and their information in principle, possession or stewardship is more concrete. So it's that physical control of data. And again, possession then becomes a mechanism by which ownership is also asserted and protected. So if First Nations choose to, they should have a right to possess their data. And so with that being said, thinking about issues with infrastructure, so how then, if a community wants to possess their data, perhaps how could part of the project be then supporting the development of that capacity or for that First Nation or First Nations to be able to do that? So these are again the OCAP principles, and they're associated, really they're operationalized and surveilled, I guess, by the First Nations Information Governance Center. But it's important to understand that these are principles that are owned by the First Nations communities themselves. And so every First Nation community has a right to use and apply these principles. But if you're using them and you're not doing work on behalf of a First Nations, then it's important to go to their website, because they have some specific wording that you need to use and some process to be able to use the proper term OCAP. And this is because of the long-standing history of appropriation and misuse of these terms. So I've included their web address here as well. And we can include this at the end of all our sessions when we do a wrap up of all the different resources too. And they have other different materials as well. And they also offer a short course, which is, I believe, fairly inexpensive if anyone is interested in learning more about the OCAP principles. And so the second, I guess, set of principles or framework that I wanted to bring to your attention. So this is something that I created when I worked for a different organization at the time. And I wanted to use this one for two reasons. One, I think it's pretty accessible in terms of the concepts and the language that's used. But I also wanted to use it because it's a tree model. It's called the tree framework. And so again, thinking back to different ways of knowing, or thinking back to our relationship with the land. So still within Western research today, and this was talked about in terms of in our comment section today, just like there's been this long-standing history of Indigenous peoples seen as objects of research. The land, so the animal nations, the bird nations, the insect nations, etc., are still very much viewed as objects of research as well. And so within our paradigms as Indigenous peoples, we understand that we can learn from empirical observation of these different non-human nations, but we also recognize the land as our teachers, and in many ways, as our elders. So if you think about some trees, for example, they're much older than us. Or if you think about the rocks, how old the rocks are, and so how much more knowledge they have than ourselves. And so if anyone, for example, has ever been to one of our ceremonies, for example, if you've been to a sweat lodge ceremony, when those rocks come into the lodge, that's how we greet them. We greet them as our grandfathers and our grandmothers. And we acknowledge within that space all of the knowledge that they have and that how they're going to provide us guidance within that space. So that concept is different than perhaps that idea of account. And so because we understand the land being our teachers, and we have many different teachings that are embedded within the land. So our knowledge systems are place-based. So we can't just, right, because our knowledge systems are place-based, we can't take our knowledge and try to colonize people over the ocean, overseas, because our knowledge systems aren't relevant there. We won't see the same animals, right? We won't see maybe this plant. So that helps keep us within our particular territory. But so because our knowledge systems are place-based and we learn from the land, it's embedded within everything. Our ceremonies are related to the land, our teachings are related to the land, our stories are related to the land. And so if we apply that concept and we understand that those teachings and those knowledges, it's very easy to live your life in a good way if you're living on the land, because every day, every minute of every day, you're reminded of those important teachings, and your teachers are all around you. And so that's why I wanted to introduce you to this framework, because I'm going to talk about in some ways how the tree can be our teacher in terms of understanding how to conduct Indigenous research in an ethical way. And so then when you're out bird watching and you see trees all around you, those trees can then be your teachers, and you'll have the reminder of these key ethical principles. So here's a model here. It speaks to, there's kind of some broader principles of creating space, truth, and mutuality. And then there's kind of 4, I guess, on the ground type principles or practices related to Indigenous worldviews and values, relationships, protocols, and ceremonies, Indigenous and participatory approaches, as well as good medicine. And so the first foundation I'm going to talk about is truth. And so this is something that we can learn from trees. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, and I myself am still learning, and I learn new things, you know, almost every day. So the trees are really important, Matig, and they teach us a lot, and they hold a lot of teachings, and yeah, provide support and guidance in many different ways. But so this is just a small piece of that. So when we think about trees, one of the teachings from trees is that they're really purposeful and transparent. So we know for a tree, they are always growing up towards the sun. And so they mimic or they teach us about trying to live that good life and leading that a straight path. And for trees as well, they also, and Western science is kind of catching up here and really discovering how trees actually interact and work together as a community. So trees are really good in terms of holding relationships and being in relationship. So for this foundation of truth, within Western research, it's usually talked about in terms of, you might hear the term maybe validity as one, or there's some other terms depending on what kind of research you're doing, maybe reliability, making sure that your results could be replicated. But historically, what has happened in research is this idea of validity or your work being valid was really situated in this idea of objectivity, or situated in this idea of actually having distance from the work that you're doing. And in some ways having control over the different aspects of what you're doing. And we still see that in terms of the scientific method to some, well, to not just to some degree, we still see it quite a bit. And so within Indigenous knowledge systems, and from what we could learn from our teacher Matig, is that idea of valid knowledge actually comes from meaningful relationships. So we could apply that both to Indigenous peoples, even outside of an Indigenous context, really, because I think Indigenous knowledge systems are not only valid for Indigenous peoples, but they have a lot to teach and offer to our global community as well. And we could also apply this concept to working with non-human nations as well. So the more you have a deep understanding and meaningful relationships, the better place you'll be in to be able to understand what's happening, to actually create a research project that will be useful to solving the problem, to then create a design that will result in relevant and useful information as well. So in terms of validity, right, so understanding things like not only our relationships to these animals, the importance of place, cultural identity, all of these things are important. And so even thinking back to in one session in particular we had last week, we had a conversation kind of about representation. And, you know, while I contacted Chief and Council and, you know, the community still doesn't seem to be really involved in the project. So that's definitely a great step. So making sure you're having some contact with the First Nation, but is perhaps sending an email or conversation with Chief and Council enough to fulfill, to have validity, when we know validity comes from meaningful relationships. So what do you know about the community? What do you know about the heartbeat of the community? What do you know about or do you know who the grassroots leaders are within the community? Do you know who the elders are? Do you know those who are responsible or have knowledge related to land within the community? So once you know that, then that provides a basis of, you know, the appropriate people in the community to speak to design a project that the community is going to be engaged in, because they're going to actually see it as relevant and useful to their community. And it's kind of a funny thing working in Indigenous context. And this is a point that an Indigenous scholar, Angela Wilson, made, and she works in history. But she even noted too that, right, if you're working in different contexts, so if you're, say, an Egyptologist, or if you're interested in classical studies, the expectation is that, right, you would know, for example, classical studies, you'd even be versed in Latin. But she said the same kind of understandings don't necessarily apply in Indigenous contexts. So many times those who come into Indigenous communities to work not only don't know the history of communities, don't have relationships, but they don't have that context of Indigenous worldviews. And so being able to understand or engage in some language learning, to listen to some teachings, to understand kind of those root perspectives is also really helpful. And so to do that, not to do it from a place of, I know this, I'm an expert in this, and now I'm going to teach others about this. So not to use it too for your own personal gain, but to have that information so that you're in a better place to actually engage in these meaningful relationships. And so then when you're working within Indigenous contexts, then legitimacy also comes from within Indigenous knowledge systems. So if not, we're just kind of continuing that colonial process of we're going to take our understandings, so that idea of whiteness as a social construct, and we're going to apply it to your setting. And so the second foundation is creating space. And this is probably what's commonly referred to now as two-eyed seeing. And so, creating, I'm thinking about mutuality here. So creating space is the second foundation. And this one is really speaking to understanding those power relationships. And so I think one thing we can learn about, another thing that we learned from the jack pine is that it's really resilient too. And other trees also have this resiliency, and they can really carve out space to grow. So here you see trees growing on a rock face. And so I think about the determination to be able to grow in that space. And so if we all had that same determination and will that the jack pine tree has to trying to address the colonial injustices that we see in our communities and within this territory, I think we'd be a lot further along. So here again, there's a lot that we could learn from the jack pine. And so it's important in terms of creating space that you're acknowledging the power relationships, historical relationships, as well as your own assumptions. And so again, last week we talked a bit about those historical relationships between Indigenous peoples and conservation and environmentalism, and even how those have implications for power relations today. So, right, we know conservation is one of the justifiable causes for infringing on Aboriginal and treaty rights. And there's also a personal component here in terms of your own assumptions. So what are your own assumptions about what conservation is, how you engage in conservation, how it's measured, and how that's achieved? And so it's really, again, important that we take time and we really critically and honestly ask ourselves, how is our project actually carving out space? So if we're going to refer to a project as reconciliation, how is it working to disrupt current processes of power and privilege and norms. And so this foundation, especially I think within our current situation or context of Indigenous and settler relationships, is really important. And I won't make all the connections for you here, but an exercise you can do is even thinking about some of these principles and how they actually align with the principles of reconciliation. And you'll notice even within this framework, there's spaces that align with the OCAP principles as well. So when I think about this foundation of creating space, and I think back to the 10 principles of truth and reconciliation, I think about how this one has the opportunity to not only have us engage in truth sharing, but also to redress past harms and to actually motivate concrete and transformative actions as well. And maybe my last point on this here is, I think it's really always important. The part about including Indigenous perspectives or worldviews is very important, but it could be really damaging if it's not also paired with a foundation such as this, where it's really focused on challenging colonial relationships. Because if not, then perhaps one of two things could happen. One, we actually create a space where Indigenous knowledges can become appropriated by non-Indigenous peoples. And two, we could create a situation where the issue is then seen as a cultural deficit. Or perhaps then when we implement something and it is not seen as fully effective, then we gauge that as culture being ineffective. But we know it's really difficult to try to move forward as we are still continuing to experience colonialism on a day-to-day basis. So those two really need to go hand in hand. So this is the other foundation I was talking about, mutuality, which is often referred to, I think is very similar to the term two-eyed seeing, which is a term that came out of the Mi'kmaq Nation along the East Coast. And so when we think about the jack pine, one thing I think that's really amazing about the jack pine is that they harness both water and fire for renewal and growth. So to reproduce, right, they need fire to open and release their seeds. And then like other trees, they also need water to survive. And at the same time, we know, right, water and fire, those are part of our elements more broadly on the earth. And we need both too. But we also need to think about the balance between them. So if there's too much water, it'll put out the fire. If there's too much fire, then things will be really dry and there'll be no more water. So we can learn a lot from this in terms of how we can work together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, as well as with Indigenous knowledges and Western knowledges. So I think throughout these processes, it's important to respect differences, but at the same time, qualify what respecting differences means. So sometimes this sort of language has, again, kind of been co-opted or appropriated as a way to continue privileging concepts of whiteness. And so when we're thinking about mutuality too, within the context of Indigenous settler relations, we really need to think about these knowledge systems equitably. So, and this is well documented in terms of the conversations and literature on two-eyed seeing as well. So how can we draw from strengths within both knowledge systems, but again, do so in a way that acknowledges the other foundation of creating space. And so how can we then identify points of convergence? And those are usually the points that are most often used, but then also have more difficult conversations about, you know, if there are different aspects of Indigenous knowledge that really challenge perhaps your beliefs or assumptions or your research design, not to shy away from those, to actually take time to understand them and to see what would happen if they could be applied. And at the same time, I think in terms of the work that you're doing and the philosophy of many Indigenous peoples, there is a commonality there. So within Indigenous nations, there's a concept of 7 generations. So that idea of wanting to make sure that we leave the world in the same place or a better place than when we first arrived here, that resonates, I would assume, within a conservation context. But where the difference lies is that how perhaps we understand that and how we achieve that. So having the openness and the humility to listen about what may be some alternative strategies that could get us to our same common long-term goal that we both have. And so in terms of practice, the importance of Indigenous worldviews and values. And so this is a painting by Peter Whitebird, and it shows using roots as thread. And so our worldviews and our values really need to be that overarching structure in terms of Indigenous research. And this goes back to that point that was mentioned about, well, how does that perhaps change how we engage with the birds? And so there's even more broadly in terms of conservation, and we think about, for example, bear management practices. And so a lot of the emphasis has really been placed on moving bears away from human environments. And there's been, I think, less of an emphasis on how are we actually focusing in on the responsibility of humans? How are we degrading the bears' territory where they're coming into town? How are we not caring for our own garbage in our own yards, which is attracting the bears in? So instead, the focus is on kind of making us comfortable and removing the bears. So when we think about even birds, so when Dr. Bone was showing me different images we could use for the poster for this session, and she showed me ones for a couple of different birds, and I chose the crane because the crane for us as Anishinaabe people is actually one of our main clans. And so we have 2 clans that are responsible for governance, and they're both bird clans. So the loon and the crane clan. And so the loon is responsible for the internal governance within our nations and our communities. And then the crane is the clan that's responsible for the outward governance. So would be responsible for Indigenous settler relations. So that's why I chose that image, because again, to me, it demonstrates that there's a lot that we can learn from birds beyond the idea of objects of research. And I won't go into too much detail here, but we have birds, and this is something that I'm still learning about too, but we have birds that help us in different ways. We have birds that are responsible for helping us in the maintenance of our language, for example. So it's just a fundamentally different way of relating, where we really understand the knowledge and the agency that exists within the non-human world. And so even in terms of Indigenous research conducted by Indigenous peoples, we still are working to decolonize our own Indigenous research processes too. So, you know, it's quite possible you could be working with an Indigenous community, and these sorts of things may or may not come up within your conversation. But I think there's different things that could be done. Is one, having a knowledge holder work with you throughout the process and help guide that. And do that in a very meaningful way. So often what we see is knowledge holders asked to come to sessions to do an opening and to do a closing. And they aren't involved in the rest of the session in a meaningful way. One, maybe they aren't giving a place to speak to it, but two, they aren't really engaged in the way of giving the proper background information and different things like that to even be in a place to fully participate. And many of our knowledge holders are really humble too. And so we're hesitant to kind of what may be seen as kind of overstepping, even though they have so much to offer in terms of these different processes. So Indigenous knowledge systems are central. And so if you are including Indigenous knowledge holders, it's important to treat them equitably. So that includes paying them at a rate that would be equivalent to other experts. And also how you're framing that as well. So are you framing a knowledge holder as a cultural holder? Or are you framing them as a scientific expert? Because our knowledge holders are both. So I think kind of the way that again, we're framing them can often put them in a, you know, kind of confine them to our particular space and actually restrict their ability to engage in a very meaningful way. So it's important that we're treating our knowledge holders both in terms of compensation, but overall in an equitable way. And again, this relates directly to the OCAP principles, the idea that the complexity and ownership of Indigenous knowledges is recognized. So here, this goes back to the principles. There's a few principles that talk specifically to the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges. And there's also one principle that talks about the importance of privileging Indigenous concepts of reconciliation within your work. So this practice would relate to both of those. And then the importance of relationship protocol and ceremony, acknowledging that these may look different in different communities. So sometimes it may be following a set of values. In other cases, it could be specific protocols or particular ceremonies. And so it's important, I think, if you're asked to participate in these sorts of things, that you do so, and that you're able to do that with an open mind and with humility as well. And so this, again, lends itself to the conversation we had earlier about also the importance of spiritual knowledge. And so how maybe we even think about protocols and ceremonies. So protocols and ceremonies aren't a cultural add-on. So protocol may be an important part to the validity of research by developing meaningful relationships. And ceremony, that may actually be part of your data collection or interpretation process, and also be very important. And so at the same time too, when we're engaging in protocols or ceremony in Indigenous contexts, again, it's important to be mindful of what are the laws that govern that. And usually people will be upfront about what those are. So what do you share or what do you not share about the ceremony that you participated in? So maybe it's appropriate, but maybe it's not appropriate to actually write about that in detail in your final report, for example. And then also, what's your role in that too? So a lot of ceremonies, an important piece of it is the preparation piece. So for example, to get ready and build a sweat lodge, that's a lengthy process. That's, you know, before the actual lodge, that's a full day process. You have to gather the stones, you have to build the lodge, so you have to harvest the wood, you have to harvest the boughs for the floor of the lodge. There's a lot of different pieces there. So being able to show up to a ceremony, you have to acknowledge all that work that was done. And if invited to participate in that part, that part is equally as important. And I'm just noticing we have a question here. Oh, okay. So Indigenous and participatory approaches. So we use boughs of trees for shelter in different ways. And so I think there's different ways that we could, or frameworks that we could use to conduct research that actually create that shelter for us to engage in a lot of this work that we need to do this kind of research in a meaningful way. So there's Indigenous approaches to research, and there's also participatory. So there's an ongoing debate as to when and how non-Indigenous peoples can engage or lead Indigenous approaches. So I put participatory approaches here because I think if you do this in a really meaningful way, you could have very similar outcomes. And so that just refers to really that governance piece and involving Indigenous peoples throughout the whole process in a very meaningful way, which acknowledges their governance over their territory and acknowledges their expertise. And so that for the sake of time, I'll just move on to the last one. And so this is outcomes. So just like many other trees, same as the jack pine. So trees are medicine. And that's something that Cree ethicist Willie Ermine talks about, is really at a basic level. Well, I don't know if basic is the right word. I think it's a simplistic understanding, but has very deep meaning. But that ethics really needs to be about this idea of creating good medicine or creating wellness. And so if we could keep the focus on that, I think that's a good way to approach ethical research. And so just like there's medicines that come from the jack pine, our research also has to result in good medicine. And so this comes by way of having relevant and useful information, as well as actionable outcomes as well. So again, this is very similar to that idea of reconciliation where, okay, the truth piece is important, but we need to move past that too. And so how can research offer a way for us to engage in actionable items that result in practical and good outcomes for Indigenous peoples and for the land? So outcomes need to be relevant and useful. So again, if information is being understood or interpreted from a lens that is foreign, then what's coming out of that may not be very relevant or useful information. Or if that particular context around conservation and Indigenous rights is not understood, there could be negative repercussions there as well. So how is the information that you're all contributing to actually being used? Who's using it? Who's then going to take that information and present that? Who's going to take that information and who's going to be the decision makers about it? And so then what is your responsibility beyond the report or whatever that'll be written? So is that where the responsibility ends? So we have an understanding within Indigenous traditions about storytelling. And so when you hear a story, there's an aspect of responsibility there. So if you know that story, then you have a responsibility in relation to that story, to the teachings within that story, to live that story in many ways. So the story that's created here, what is your responsibility from that moving forward? So you have to think about things of how could this information be utilized? Could it be utilized within particular contexts of conservation that could actually be used to impact, try to usurp Indigenous peoples' rights or sovereignty over their own territory, for example? And then how are you ensuring this information is relevant to Indigenous peoples and accessible? So what kind of formats? So a written report, may be great for the technical staff, but certainly everyone in the community isn't going to read the written report. So are there other ways that you could actually disseminate that information as well? So I wanted to leave us a bit more time for discussion today. And so this is the question that you have. And I put this image here too, again, understanding or working from the place where the trees could actually be our teachers. So think about this as this is you kind of surrounded by your teachers who've shared a number of different practices and principles for us to consider in how to engage in Indigenous research or research as reconciliation. And so now think about, within the context of the Bird Atlas, ways that you think you are, but then also how could you implement research as reconciliation? And perhaps a good organizing framework for this is to think about the different steps of research. So I know we're already at the point of data collection, but if we could even take it back, and so think about even in terms of framing the issue. So how could that reflect research as reconciliation? And then the research design, and then the data collection, and then the interpretation, and then the dissemination of results and beyond within the context of governance. So all of those pieces. And this is really just an activity. By no means is the expectation, right? Whatever is talked about here is then has to change the course of your project this minute, this day, but just really use it as an opportunity, not to criticize what you're doing, but within the framework of how could you perhaps vision your work moving forward, or how could you expand the possibilities of what your work looks like? So I'm just going to stop share right now, and I'm going to put everyone into groups. So maybe I'll give everyone a bit more time, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes to have that discussion, and then we can come back and then we could report on our conversations. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I wanted to leave a little bit of time just for people to report back and have a bit of a discussion. So I think there was 5 groups. Is there one group that wants to go first and maybe share some of their discussion?
This is Andrew from Group 4. We didn't really pick anybody to sort of report back on things, but I think one of the main things that came out was the fact that we were all, as a whole, we were overwhelmed by all the sort of knowledge and information that we've received over the last about 2 sessions, and it's very, very difficult. The atlas is at a stage where it's ready to move forward, and I think we really appreciate that there's a need to continually build bridges during the whole of the process of the atlas process, and it may be a little bit late to put everything correctly in place for the Ontario Atlas, but this is going to help inform other Atlas projects across the country as well. It's going to help us, really help us moving forward.
Yeah, no, and even for this, even at this point, if it's just perhaps a point of disruption, right? I think that was kind of one of the main outcomes I'm trying to achieve. So even if right at this stage you can't go back and redesign the project, or perhaps even, you know, think about what would be a project that would achieve what we want to regarding conservation. But I think often where we get restricted is in terms of placing our own limitations on what could be possible. So even just seeing this session as really just a place to explore and to disrupt maybe notions that we have around what could even be possible, what could it look like. So there's no expectation of making promises in terms of this session around. It could really be any idea that you conceive of that you think would fit within the current atlas, or even something that may think about it different. But yeah,
one point that was brought up was, sorry, another thing that was brought up was the fact that it would be really, really interesting to look at the way that Indigenous people sort of monitor bird populations and things, and just compare those with the sort of Atlas projects to see whether there are similar trends and things that are generated from that information, could be generated from that information.
Yeah, and so even I think what you're articulating there is kind of the need for more knowledge and learning. So sometimes it's that idea too, right, of we don't know what we don't know. So I think the more of that occurs, then probably on both sides, seeing more of a possibility of what future projects might look like.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Does someone else want to go from one of the other 4 groups who hasn't went yet?
I can mention a couple things that came up in our group. I think one of the themes was sort of meeting people and getting to know them. You know, talking about the project and what the Atlas is and all of that, and inviting people to participate. So sort of the theme was more relationship building instead of just sort of data collection alone. I think one of the things that might be useful for at least the regional coordinators to know a little bit more about is which communities were involved and how they were involved in the last Atlas. So maybe that's something we can still dig up. We started talking a little bit about telling the story, that phase of the Atlas, but we didn't get too far there, unless I missed something, anybody in group.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and even relates back to the principles of reconciliation. So kind of the process has already happened before. There has been some Indigenous peoples involved. Having a conversation from your perspective, right? How do you think this went? Is there things that we could have done differently? Is there things that you would have liked to see? So I think that's a really great example. And then after this iteration, there'll be even more opportunities for that as well. So I think that goes back to the idea of the reflection, but also not that necessarily what you're doing is harmful, but kind of ensuring that, right, if there are things that were done in the past that perhaps may be colonial, that they aren't done moving forward. So yeah, that's a really great practical and tangible example of something that could be implemented. Miigwech. What about, does anyone want to share from any of the other 3 remaining groups?
Not sure. Seems everyone's being more quiet today for some reason. I could just give a couple points from our group. We mostly discuss the data collection part of the atlas, since that's like right in front of us right now and is starting. And the two concepts we kind of got into were relationships and mutuality. So the relationship's a little bit different from what Russ was talking about, that it piqued our interest, this idea of the relationship between trees and birds. And there is a sort of Western science viewpoint on that trees provide habitat, and there's, you know, whatever biotic factors that lead to that, but some interest in maybe expanding that in terms of our learning about some Indigenous ways of knowing about those relationships that might provide some really interesting learning experiences and relationship building stuff, as well as helping us understand better how birds are functioning and surviving on the landscape. And then the mutuality piece was also about the concept that trying to find ways to make sure that the work that we're doing is benefiting communities in the work and what is important to them and what they're moving forward with. And I think I'll just finish by saying, I think we realize that we need to have more conversation and probably book in some more time to continue having these.
Yeah, and there's definitely stories that we have that talk about just that, birds needing a place to live, especially in the winter, and trees actually being given that responsibility. So even, yeah, thinking about that within an Indigenous context, and then how that relates to a Western viewpoint as well. Some similarities, but maybe just a bit of a different framing in how that's approached. But that lends itself, yeah, to holistic ideas about conservation and the importance of relationships. What about, did anyone have a conversation about that piece around reconciliation? So about framing the project as reconciliation. So did anyone in your group talk about maybe some areas where there may be some tensions, for example, between the term reconciliation and the work of the atlas? And so maybe this goes to the point around mutuality. So this is great as a starting point, right? We often focus on what are those pieces that most easily come together. But then also thinking about, you know, what are those pieces that may really challenge our norms, or may really challenge our own privileges, our own notions about how we're engaging in reconciliation. So I think going back to maybe one of the terms we've talked about around a move towards innocence. So how are ways that we are actually forwarding pieces of reconciliation, but then are there also ways where perhaps resources or design could be different, that could perhaps be more impactful? So maybe I'll just leave this as a closing thought. And I'm not saying this to tell people to actually go out and do it, but again, I'm saying as one of those points of disruption. So when I was talking to John and when I was talking to Julie about the atlas, they were sharing with me that there's going to be around 10,000 people who are engaging in citizen science to work on this bird atlas. And I thought 10,000 people is a lot of people. And so I was thinking about 10,000 people, that's a lot of political will as well, to have 10,000 people within Ontario. So when we're thinking of conservation, for example, I could even think of Julie when she did her first land acknowledgement, and she acknowledged the land defenders who have been doing that work all over Canada, and who often suffer state violence when trying to do that work, when trying to be lawful and uphold their Anishinaabe laws. So we're doing conservation in a particular way here by doing bird observation, right, and different observation. And so that's really valuable too. I'm not trying to discredit that in any way, but also just thinking about what kind of other activities could take place that could result in change if 10,000 people, the same amount of birders, got together within Ontario. What would it have looked like, for example, when the Mohawk Nation were carrying out their acts of solidarity for the Wet'suwet'en Nation in terms of protection of their lands, if these 10,000 people came together and actually supported that initiative as well? So how would that maybe have worked to address issues of power and privilege in perhaps a different way? How would something like that, would it be outside your comfort? So maybe those are just some closing thoughts to think about if we're in this space of really disruption and really transforming and thinking about possibilities for reconciliation, even beyond the Atlas. So what are some further activities of reconciliation that could be achieved that you think would be very meaningful for Indigenous peoples, would articulate or work within Indigenous concepts of conservation, however, may be outside of your comfort level, and what the implications, though, for transformative change may be within those spaces. So I'm just going to leave that there as some closing food for thought for everyone. And again, I wanted to say miigwech to everyone for listening today. Oh, and I see Andrew has a comment.
I was just going to say that somebody in our group brought up the fact that there was an Indigenous Engagement Committee that's in place, and perhaps some of this reconciliation work and outreach is something that they could also be involved with more closely.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Whenever there's opportunities for like engagement, where again people have the knowledge base and have been given like the information of what's going on to engage in a meaningful way, that's really important too. So yeah, great suggestion. I see we're just 1 minute over, so again, miigwech, and I'll pass it over to Julie, who I think has some closing remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Dr. Ray again for giving us her time and sharing her time and expertise with us today. And I really appreciate the framing around these two sessions being about a bit of disruption, being maybe a little bit unsettling as part of that's how reconciliation is supposed to proceed. So hopefully, I know it's a lot of information and it's somewhat overwhelming, but hopefully it's just a time to reflect and rethink and determine how we want to move forward from here. So miigwech. I want to thank John Hassel for taking care of the technical parts of this today, keeping everything running smoothly. Also thanking ECCC and CWS who provided the financial support so we could run this particular webinar series. We really appreciate that. And thanking everybody for coming today and participating and engaging, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to continue these conversations, because we really were only able to sort of start scratching the surface. And I know there's a lot of questions, probably raise more questions than answers for us, a lot of this work. I also just wanted to let everyone know that we will be circulating some sort of survey related to the webinars or Indigenous engagement broadly. We're just working through what that will be. Sharing, as Dr. Ray mentioned, sharing wrap-up information, additional resources, and the videos will be available for anyone who wasn't able to attend, or if you would like to go back and look at some of the content again. And that will be happening over the next few weeks. There's also some interest in having adding possibly another Indigenous engagement session to the launch weekend on April 24th and 25th. So we'll be collectively working through how to provide that and in ways that will benefit Atlasers participating in that. And then just lastly, please feel free to connect with me at juleeb@ontarionature.org. If you have any additional questions or looking for additional resources or comments. And I hope we can continue to host these kinds of learning sessions as we move forward. And thanks, everyone. Have a good day.